Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I'm the co-director of the Center for Ideas Society. I'll be working as our host and facilitator for this conversation. Folks could please, that are in attendance, please continue to feel free to add your greetings and your acknowledgements in the chat. We got folks from all over the world here. Really looking forward to this conversation with everybody. So just to remind everybody, this conversation is being recorded. We will be posting the recording on the Center for Ideas and Society Vimeo channel. And I'm really happy and proud to say that this is part of the Decolonizing Humanism activity stream that I'm really proud to be kind of leading and initiating. So again, folks, this is being recorded, and anybody in attendance who needs to do so, you can access live transcription at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you're familiar with that. So allow me to begin by honoring Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy at UC Riverside and in Riverside of cultivating an indigenous bodily, archival, and epistemological presence at this campus and beyond. I want to open our time together by recognizing the unceded sovereignty of the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, as well as their ancestors and their descendants, past, present, and future. UCR and the surrounding lands are inhabited by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world, many of whom are among the faculty, students, and staff of this institution. I also want to begin by reminding and acknowledging and honoring the fact that UC Riverside, our place of employment, is just blocks away from the place where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller in 1998. It's a reminder that this institution and the University of California generally have a long history of proximity to and active complicity in anti-Black state and state condoned violence. So it's with a sense of humble gratitude and urgent obligation that I ask us to confront the conditions that surround and permeate our gathering today. And I look forward to continuing to work with many of you to decolonize this planet, this world, this way of being, and to create possibilities for abolitionists' thriving thought and creativity. And that's what brings us here today. I'm the co-director. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I'm a faculty member at UC Riverside. I'm a co-director of the Center for Ideas and Society with my colleague, Jeanette Cole. Perhaps more importantly, I'm a proud part of the Critical Resistance Abolitionist Educators Collective and have been working with critical resistance since its earliest days in 1997. What brings me to you all as an abolitionist practitioner, worker, teacher, creator, community builder, collaborator, instigator, is the acknowledgement that we are in fact in a condition of ongoing asymmetrical warfare, colonial warfare and anti-Black warfare with derivatives and the logic of plantation slavery and well beyond. And I'm with my colleagues and friends and loved ones today to try to think about how to transform and abolish that condition. So I was asked to introduce and frame the conversation that we're about to have by thinking about a couple questions. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll move from there into the body of the conversation. So the first question that the group of us thought about was, I think in some ways, the most urgent one, which is, why did we feel compelled to produce yet another resource guide that is addressing criminalization, prisons, incarceration, policing, and for that matter, abolition? I think there's something really specific about producing and releasing this resource guide now. And if it's okay, I'll ask that one of us puts the link to the resource guide in the chat as a reminder. We'll do that intermittently throughout the conversation so folks can easily access it. But part of the urgency around this moment in this conversation is that there's been a detectable uptick, even a kind of flood in the usage, a popularization of the language and the terms of abolition. There's a circulation of abolition rhetoric, abolition as a kind of political desire, even a feeling, abolitionist symbols, aesthetics, principles of abolition. All those things have driven the unprecedented period of uprising and revolt against anti-Black police and state violence that characterized so much of the calendar year of 2020 and beyond. Now, we've got that. And I think all of us that are here talking with you all today celebrate and honor that. At the very same time, I think what concerns us collectively is that alongside the circulation and popularization of abolitionist thought and rhetoric, there has also emerged a predictable problem, and that is appropriations, misinterpretations, and even political and cultural domestications of abolition that commodify the terms rather than activate broader collective practices and thought around the primary principles of abolishing incarceration and policing as forms of asymmetrical warfare, colonial anti-Black warfare, and otherwise. So I think our concern in the urgency that animates this resource guide is how these appropriations, misinterpretations, and political domestications of abolitionist analysis and collective histories of organizing, that is movement, both movement in the traditional sense of social movement, but I'm also thinking about artistic forms of collective movement, scholarly movement, forms of streams of research, critical research that happen well beyond academic and university settings. These have been flowing for literally centuries. And our concern is how the misinterpretations and appropriations of these traditions have actually been a rather characteristic and opportunistic response of people and organizations who tend to be based in academic, philanthropic, and liberal nonprofit institutions. So you see this detectably with institutions like the Ford and Mellon Foundations, who have started funding what they call abolitionist work, right? And I think that raises some significant concern and skepticism, right? Some need for critical analysis of what these kinds of philanthropic organizations are naming and propping up and literally funding with millions of dollars as appropriate, proper abolitionist work. I'm also thinking of high-profile, well-funded nonprofit organizations, like, for example, Campaign Zero, right? They're behind this hashtag called hashtag 8can'twait, right? Which made significant use, appropriative, and opportunistic use of abolitionist terms. Thinking of even of things like the Brennan Center for Justice, the Brookings Institution. We can go on down the line. So what the Abolitionist Resource Guide intends to do is to provide a live, collective, archival response to the way abolitionist terms and concepts are subjected to commodification and rebranding in this moment. We're trying to get people to think more deeply about what abolition is. So that's the first thing that brings us together in producing the resource guide. The second thing is the question of collective study, the challenge of collective study. Study is different in this abolitionist context, in the context of collective work. It's different than the way we might think about study as defined by the academy, for that matter, by K through 12 schooling in the conventional sense. Here, what we want to advocate, we want to, I think, really personify and embody and exemplify together is how study is praxis. Study is inseparable from radical revolutionary, anti-colonial liberation and Black radical movements. Study has always been central in the abolitionist tradition. It has always been central and inseparable as well from a specific history and archive of what has been called most recently and amplified most recently as Black study, a diasporic tradition of Black thought within Black liberation struggle and abolitionist activity. So study has never been separate from movement, from revolt, from transformation. Study in that sense is a collective activity. It is what we're trying to exemplify today. It's a collective activity that reflects on, it critically informs, it debates, it collectively analyzes the conditions in which people struggle to create life, to create collective ways of being that are liberated from the long historical present tense violence of anti-Blackness, of coloniality in its many forms, of the policing of sexuality and gender normativity, the targeted asymmetrical warfare of what Cedric Robinson called racial capitalism, and so forth. Right? So that's the framework. That's what brings us together here. I'll say that I'm really looking forward to playing the role of facilitator. You're not going to hear much from me for the rest of this conversation. But I welcome everyone who's here and who's watching this, who's going to be watching this recording later. So let me transition now to a series of self-introductions by my fellow members of the Critical Resistance Abolitionist Educators Group. I'll ask all of them to please introduce themselves in whatever way they wish. And then after introductions, I'll immediately jump in and pose a series of questions to our roundtable participants. After they respond to those, I will open up the question and answer from participants here. Please make use of the question and answer button. And we will call it quits at about 1:15 because I think the point here is to catalyze instigate and get you all moving on your own out of this. So we'll go from there. So let me start with Shana.
Dylan, I knew you were going to do that. My name is Shana Agid. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here. I think when we first started thinking about pulling this together, we thought, maybe a handful of people we know would show up. So it's fantastic to see that this conversation is of interest to so many people's practices. I go by she and he or they. I'm based right now in Upper Manhattan, looking out over a snowy park. I'm actually going to introduce myself in this way, and hopefully the other panelists who suggested this will follow suit, because otherwise I'm going to be out here on my own. Which is that one of the very first things I ever did as a member of Critical Resistance back in 1999, 2000, before there really were members, was to help organize the Critical Resistance East Conference. After which point we spent some time together with people who had organized the first conference in California in 1998. And I remember being in a breakout room, and I was a tot at the time, a young tot. And I remember being in a breakout room with Dylan, who said a thing to me that I have never forgotten. I don't even know that I've told you this, Dylan, which I think people say all the time now, but in I think at the time it was 2001, which was that oftentimes it's imagined that the artists are the only people who are sort of allowed to or encouraged to dream, and that in fact abolitionist praxis relies on being able to dream and imagine. And it's something that has guided me in many ways ever since, both as an artist, which I am, but also as someone who understands all things that are valuable to be practiced. So I will start there. And Dylan, I think, is handing it from person to person. Thank you all for being here.
Appreciate you, Shana. I'm convinced I never said that, but thank you. Priya, I got you next.
Okay, well, thank you all. And thank you to everyone for organizing this event too. I'm really excited to be here, and I echo Shana's sentiment that I just really have so much appreciation for the fact that so many people have turned out to be a part of this conversation. So my name is Priya Kandaswamy, and kind of following in Shana's vein, I wanted to sort of introduce myself by saying that I came to abolitionist work largely through my engagements with feminism and the anti-violence movement. But I came to abolitionist teaching very much through a lot of the people in this room. And so my actual first experience teaching anything was as a GSI, a graduate student instructor for Dylan's course on the prison industrial complex, what is now like decades ago. And I think one of the things that Dylan did as an instructor was force me to teach a class, and it was absolutely terrifying to me at the time. It was sort of my first real experience up in front of the classroom. And I learned so much from doing that. And I learned so much about the prison industrial complex actually from being a part of the conversations that we were having in that class. And I also think looking at our kind of resource guides now, the way the conversation has both shifted and not shifted in the 25 some years, I think, is really an interesting thing to think about. I also wanted to share that the very first academic panel I was on at a conference was organized by Shana, and it was also about teaching abolition. And so I feel like there's just so much just wonderful like energy around thinking about abolition in relation to pedagogy in this group. And it's been just such a formative part of my thinking over many years beyond the life of this particular project.
Thank you, Priya. I got Melissa, you're up.
Thanks, Dylan, and thanks to everyone. I am Melissa Burch. I'm based in Michigan right now, and I was a student and teacher of abolition for a long time before I started getting paid to do so in university classrooms. I first came to the work as an organizer with Critical Resistance based in New Orleans back in 2001. And I think when I think back to that time, what stands out for me most and what I cherish most and want to sort of lift up for the purposes of this conversation is just how collective that experience was of teaching and learning. I mean, while there were certainly a set of ideas to learn, and it's not that there wasn't a political line, it was definitely a very back and forth process of dialogue and argument and sort of trying to figure it out. And I feel like the guide that we've created remains very much in that spirit of learning about abolition as an ongoing thing, not something that you sort of arrive and, someday complete the course or check off. And also that it's really different than, a lot of the kind of thinking and writing that we do in academic settings that's so isolated. I think it has to be done together.
Beautiful, thank you for that. I've got Erica.
Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you today from the unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi, also known as Chicago. I'm an educator, organizer, and a writer, and I use she, her, or they pronouns are fine. I was trying to think of a good CR or CR related story, and I was remembering that I had the distinct pleasure, I think it was over 10 years ago, to Priya and I overcame our mutual introvertedness to co-host a fundraiser at a CR fundraiser at a seedy hotel bar. I mean, I'm calling it seedy. It wasn't the good kind of seedy. It just felt like dark and depressing seedy hotel bar in Oakland. And we probably raised, I mean, this is an arbitrary number, but like $186 or something. But it was an important kind of political reminder about doing teaching and learning work in public. It's really, to underscore some of my comrades' comments, it's really a privilege to be here, an honor to be here, a joy to be here with folks that I continue to learn and work alongside, a motley crew, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. And finally, Setsu.
Hello, everyone. My birth name is Setsu Shigematsu, and I use the pronouns she, her, them as a reminder of the power of words to make change. I started working with Melissa Burch in 2005 when she was the staff person of Critical Resistance Los Angeles. And she was at the time working with Susan Burton, who is the founder of a New Way of Life reentry project for women coming home from prison. I had the opportunity to teach a feminist self-defense workshop with and for the residents of A New Way of Life. And from that point forward, I just kept on going back for about the next 8 years, where I had the opportunity to learn directly from women and Melissa and Susan, the life and death stakes of abolitionist work. So I'm very grateful for that time together. And I am very pleased to be here as part of this group. Looking forward to today's conversation. Check.
Thank you all. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. I really appreciate that. And I've got a series of questions, and I'm going to raise them, and then I think we've got some point people to take those on. But of course, just chime in if y'all are ready to contribute. And again, folks in attendance, we've got a lot of folks here. Make use of the Q&A. We're obviously not going to be able to get to everything, but I think raising the questions in the box is helpful. And I think we'll try to do our best to transcribe some of those questions, maybe include them in the future posting of the video as well, because I think those could be points of collective study, just to kind of echo, the whole reason we created the resource guide in the first place. So the first question for the conversation is to ask us to talk about why critical resistance abolitionist educators decided to create the resource guide, to tell us a little bit about the history of the guide and its origins. And I've got Melissa kicking us off on this.
All right, thank you. So first, I'm just going to say a little bit about the critical resistance abolitionist educators, which began as an effort to think about how scholars who are committed to abolitionist politics could best use their position in the academy to support abolitionist organizing, right? And our first idea was to organize activist scholars to raise money for CR's organizing work by donating the honoraria that they receive for giving talks. But as it turned out, most of us weren't fancy enough to be bringing in much money in the form of honoraria. So we began to think about what else we could do. And I believe it was 2017 when we were sitting around a table at the American Studies Association meetings in Chicago, that we got to talking about how exciting it was to see so many more people concerned about and eager to learn about issues of policing and imprisonment, as well as abolitionist politics. But at the same time, how frustrated we were by the circulation of sort of a handful of the same few texts over and over as kind of the go-to starting points for teaching and learning about those issues, right? So texts like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, the film 13th by Ava DuVernay. Not that these aren't great texts, but our concerns were these. So one, it was not only that there was sort of a limited number of texts that seemed to be getting canonized as the analysis, right? We were also concerned about the way some study lists seemed to lump everything together in a way that had the potential to kind of evacuate abolitionism of its meaning, right? As Dylan was talking to in his introductory remarks. So our basic thought was, how we understand the thing we're fighting leads to different conclusions about how to best tackle it, right? And yet there was this kind of conflation of analyses that we saw happening that, between texts that call for example, a less biased or a more racially just criminal legal system versus texts that are pushing us to think about building societies that don't rely on punishment and control. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I actually dug up some of these old emails that were causing us to have these initial thoughts. And I'm going to read just part of a typical email that I was receiving in this moment, which I'm sure many of the people here also received, right? Okay, so the email went something like this. Many folks at this time are taking the time to educate themselves and others in their lives about topics like racial discrimination, anti-Blackness, police brutality, etc. Here is a list of books, movies, and documents that are very informative and relevant to the current moment. You can use these for your own education, and please pass them on to others in your life who want to learn more about mass incarceration, right? Something along those lines. And then the list as follows. Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, as well as the film version, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, the documentary 13th, Golden Gulag by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and also the autobiographies of Angela Davis and Malcolm X, right? So the resource guide initially was sort of a response to what we were calling this kind of everything is everything politics, in which there's no differentiation between Davis, Stevenson, Alexander, Gilmore, and by extension, there's no differentiation between mass incarceration and prison industrial complex abolition, right? So before I sound too cranky, obviously we weren't just criticizing or complaining, right? So it was this provocation though that led us to start thinking about what might actually be useful to ourselves as educators and to other educators, because at the same time that there was this uptick in the circulation of helpful study lists, there was also an uptick in the number of professors and secondary school teachers who are sort of teaching about these things, either creating new courses or incorporating analysis of policing and imprisonment in their current courses, right? And so in thinking about what might be useful, we realized that what we needed wasn't just a better list or a more comprehensive list, but rather a framework for how to think about these issues in deeper and more critical ways, right? So the original idea was sort of a retrofit kit for these, set of few texts that were circulating all the time. And we began thinking about both sort of why people find those texts so appealing and also what was missing in those analyses from our perspective, both as educators and as people who've been thinking about and working toward abolition for a long time. I realized 2017 was a long time ago. This project sort of simmered for a long while and then felt, really ever more urgent after the George Floyd uprisings. And again, this another huge bump in the circulation of lists that seem to be making this massive leap from anti-mass incarceration to abolition. And so making the resource guide, I would say, was as much about the process as the product itself. So making the guide became for us a way to do what we were sort of calling on everyone else to do, which was to do this collective intellectual work and to take the opportunity to sort of pause and think deeply about what we were doing and why.
That's beautiful. And you just echoed back how I know part of our conversations, to be really plain about it, is how so much reformist bullshit creeps into some of the most lazy reading lists that get put out, especially by academic institutions, by philanthropic organizations, by think tanks that have not fucking done the work. They have no collective engagement with abolitionist, creativity or organizing or community building or praxis. And so the stuff that comes out is bullshit. So I think, pardon me, but not really. I'm not going to apologize. But yeah, this is deep, and I think that we felt like it was a collective responsibility to deal with that and to try to produce something that y'all could use, that people here could use as a response. I got in my notes that Priya, you wanted to add something to this as well, if that's okay.
Oh, sure, I can jump in. I mean, I think Melissa spoke to this really well. And I mean, maybe the one thing that I would just emphasize is that I think we also, we're really critical of like the circulation, like the politics of circulation of certain text, and feeling like, I know I sort of had this experience of like being on a search committee and for a position to teach courses on prison and policing, and seeing all these sample syllabi, and like that every syllabi is teaching the new Jim Crow or teaching the 13th, but not teaching other things. And so I think also wanting to kind of respond to that by really circulating a different set of texts, and, encouraging, kind of responding to, what we saw as maybe like the appeal of some of these texts as a desire to, learn more about, policing and incarceration, which is a great thing, but wanting to be able to provide people with a different set of texts to start from, right? So I'm really, trying to see the resource guide as an intervention that might change the kinds of texts that circulate or engage with the politics of circulation of texts as well.
That's such an important point. Thank you for saying that. That leads into our second question, our collective question, which is, what critical interventions does the resource guide try to make, and why are those interventions so important? So I have Priya and Shana on this. Go ahead, Shana.
Priya, start us off.
Oh, okay, I can start us off on this. Like when I think about the intervention, I mean, in a way, I think that actually, like Dylan and Melissa spoke really well to the context that the resource guide was trying to intervene in, right? This sort of like, new or resurgent reformist moment in which really like, kind of seeing this like growing liberal consensus that there is something wrong with the prison system and that it should be then reformed in some way, and particularly like the fixation on things like the privatization of prisons, or things like prison labor, or sort of the role that like individualized bias plays in policing, right? Kind of fixation on particular things as things that could sort of be fixed to improve the system, rather than a critique that actually necessitates a transformation or the dismantling of that system. So when we made the resource guide, I mean, I think the intervention that we were trying to make, we're really trying to think about how a resource guide could help us and other people think about building an abolitionist analytical framework. So I think what we didn't want to do was be like, well, these are the texts you should be reading instead. And instead, what we wanted to do was to think about what would it mean to cultivate an abolitionist way of thinking, or to cultivate a reading list that was organized around, right, building analytical skills from an abolitionist perspective. And so that's why we opted to structure the resource guide around questions, right? There are 6 questions that the resource guide engages. How did we get here? How does the prison industrial complex work? What is its purpose? Who is impacted? What do abolitionists want? And how do abolitionists struggle? So in our early conversations, these questions, I think, emerged both from our critique, of some of the texts and the ways that texts circulate that Melissa was mentioning, but they also, I think, emerge for us as like maybe a constructive way, or as thinking about these questions as central to building an abolitionist analytic. In a way, right, like the questions, I think, from a pedagogical perspective are interesting, because like as teachers, we want people to like ask questions and learn how to engage with and answer questions. And I think what makes the research guide, I think, interesting and made it such a productive process for me was that like there's no single answer to any of these questions, right? Like, and all of the texts that are listed for each question, right, they aren't necessarily saying the same thing, right? Like they're approaching the question from a different angle, and they're maybe not necessarily in contradiction with each other exactly, but often, they're not exactly in agreement either, right? Like it's kind of trying to reframe abolition as a body of work, and that each text is kind of adding something to the question or helping us to see the question from a different way, but that, we as abolitionist thinkers also have to engage with that work and piece it together, right? And think about, how do these texts actually help us answer this question, or how do these texts help deepen our thinking, right? And so, I think one of the key interventions that the resource guide makes then is to sort of create a resource that helps us actually think in an abolitionist way, rather than simply define what abolition is.
I appreciate what you're just saying there, Priya. And the only thing that I sort of will just throw in here before we move on to the next question is that I think, Melissa started out by saying that, we weren't just trying to be crabby. And I think that one challenge that we issued ourselves was to think about, what was the nature of the critique we had, right? Why were we having these reactions when these lists were circulating? What felt like was actually at stake, right? Like what was getting lost? And what did that mean for things like movement building? Or what did that mean for the kinds of questions that people would ask? And so one of the ways that we wanted to go about building this guide was by looking for the gaps that were left by these really popularly sort of circulating texts. And one of the largest gaps that those texts leave is a story of resistance, right? The story of struggle, the story that is oftentimes, almost always, necessarily alongside underlying, moving sort of in concert with the very oppressive structures that are framed through some of these most popular texts. And so these questions that we framed in part by really wanting to think through, as Priya said, sort of building that sort of capacity to ask these questions in ongoing ways, and also as a way of trying to engage not only in the rejection of text, but in a sort of ongoing critical engagement with the stories that were being told and that people were sort of building. And so a piece of this, as we were talking, and part of why this took us so long is because we worked to try to get the language right, even as you will see if you read the guide that there is a note about how there's no way to always get the language right, was that we started having really long, thoughtful conversations about phrases that we used or we knew other people used all the time, right? So like prison industrial complex, for instance. And we spent a lot of time with Critical Resistance's definition of prison industrial complex. We thought about the difference between what that was naming and what it called out that had maybe not been seen previously when initially coined and when sort of, brought into the context of the first critical resistance conference. We talked about the emergence of the language of the carceral state and whether we thought the PIC and the carceral state were the same thing. We wrestled not so much with one another, but sort of with these concepts to think about how each of them is useful in different ways. And I think to a point that that everyone has made so far, how knowing the structures of the things that we are seeing, that people are experiencing, that we're fighting, and being able to articulate those structures allows us to also disarticulate them, to pull them apart, to imagine where they're weakest, to imagine where we might build other things, to imagine how to survive alongside them in the process of that. And that all of those are incredibly important. And that keeping that complexity, in fact, as difficult as it is sometimes, that keeping that complexity is actually a surer or faster or more comprehensive sort of pathway to actually being able to inquire in the ways that we need to, and to be able to fight things and build things at the same time. That the oversimplification of those structures does not actually help us end them, right? Or imagine outside of them.
Right on. I appreciate that. And just kind of a spoiler alert, y'all. If you haven't looked at the resource guide yet, a lot of what we find ourselves having to do is to come back and challenge some of the conclusions that come out of the massive circulation and canonization of works like New Jim Crow and Ava DuVernay's film 13th, right? There are a bunch of conclusions and prescriptions that come out of those two texts in particular that are poorly informed, if not reprehensible. Okay, but at the same time, which also make use of abolitionist terms to try to build a kind of credibility around. So with all due respect to both of those texts, right, we're trying to actually critically challenge the ways that those texts kind of stand in for a whole archive and body of thought that extends centuries and centuries back. Right. Again, within the Black radical tradition, this stuff goes way back. So I think it's trying to really push folks to think deeply about what Priya just called an abolitionist analytic. And the one quick thing I'll say before asking the next question to our panel is a lot of the folks who are here, I'm sure, want a quick soundbite answer to what abolition is, right? And what I appreciate about what Shana and Priya just did was that they pushed back against that tendency. And they've enunciated to us how what abolitionists do, what they create and what they convene is a challenge to the way we think and do things, right? To the way we convene community, to the way we think about certain terms like freedom, liberation, safety, security, and so forth. And also the way we go about trying to engage this world around us, that it's a method, right? So yeah, the resource guide provides some material for folks to work with on that. Let me transition to our third question, if that's okay with everybody, which is both simple and deep, right? It's both simple and complex. Why a focus on teaching and learning at this moment? And I've got Erica, I got you jumping in on this.
Yes, loving this conversation. And I'm also surprised. I just want to add, if it's not telling tales, but I felt like at a couple of times I wasn't sure we were going to get this done. Like we met every week. It felt like some weeks it was just like the same fucking sentence we were working on. But, I think it was, this project sort of had its incubation many years earlier, but we were all sort of motivated and amplified by, as Dylan and Melissa offered in the intro here, the political uprising, the moment of 2002 to really kind of continue with this work and see this work as an intervention. So I just wanted to flag, no one's telling our secrets that we spent like an entire meeting on like one sentence. Anyway, I want to flag just 3 points about teaching and learning, just the value of study, that abolition for us always has this teaching and learning component. and the project of collectivity. And those are things that my comrades have already flagged, but I'll just kind of, offer them again in different kinds of ways. That all of us have like tethers to formal post-secondary education. And of course, even though we're connected to post-secondary education, there's a lot of surface nodding to teaching and learning, but there's not actually a lot of attention to teaching and learning, even though that's ostensibly what we're supposed to be doing at colleges and universities. But I think more importantly, as we've sort of flagged in this discussion, that we all each recognize the enormous value of study, the work of study, sort of outside the corporate academic project. All of us are connected to Critical Resistance, which has a history of producing vital political educational materials and creating containers for study. Many of us have been involved in campaigns and projects. Those are vibrant sites of study and struggle. So in that sense, teaching and learning and the value of study, I think this project and our process are really kind of trying to raise those questions. The second point I wanted to flag in relation to teaching and learning is thinking about abolition, the practice of abolition as always in part about teaching and learning, a campaign to close down a prison, to stop the new construction of a jail, to challenge increased criminalization as a response to gender violence. This work is always about creating political education materials, whether they're visuals, whether they're fact sheets, direct action plans, town halls, pamphlets. These materials help us answer the question about why and how and when, right? So thinking about teaching and learning is always a part of the practice of abolition, and us recognizing that and knowing that from our work. And then finally, I just wanted to flag this theme of collectivity that we've been talking a little bit about. Abolition, the practice of abolition, because it's pedagogical work, because it's about teaching and learning and unlearning. This isn't that can't be a solitary project. This is always teaching and learning always unfolds in community, collectively. So a focus on teaching and learning really reminds us, sort of pushes us away from the project of individualism towards the messy complexity of collectivity. So just wanted to flag those three: this value of study, both inside the university, but also more essentially as connected to struggle and organizing and movements, teaching and learning as a part of abolitionist praxis, and also thinking about that is inherently collective, right? And the imperativeness of not thinking about sort of individual projects, but collective engagement.
Thanks for that, Erica. And I've got a fourth question to ask us, and then at that point, I think I'd like to open it up into Q&A. I know that there's some folks in chat that want. I think I provoked them into trying to pull from our group here to go in a little bit on New Jim Crow and 13th, and not just to pick on those two texts, although they should be picked on because they've been so widely circulated to the point of being canonical. But the forms of thought and politics that they represent, I think, is much more important than those particular individual texts. So I think we'll have an opportunity to do that, and some of the Q&A is going to bring that up as well. Our fourth question before I open it up to the Q&A that has been popping up here. Again, attendees, folks, yes, this is being recorded. We will be posting this up on the Center for Ideas and Society Vimeo channel later. I'm going to work with Critical Resistance, see if they want to post it up on their channel on YouTube as well. And there is a Q&A button that you all can use to post some questions, and we will try to get to whichever ones we can before the 1:15 stopping point. Finally, our fourth question before I open it up to the Q&A. Could you all talk about the Abolitionist Educators Group, how it went about curating the resource guide? Can you give the folks here a sense of what went into deciding what texts and what kinds of resources should go into the guide? Because we did call it a resource guide. We didn't call it a reading list. I remember we had a long conversation about that. So I've got Setsu starting us off on this one.
Okay, so jumping off from the point about sometimes we would spend a whole meeting just trying to write a sentence together. We also had long conversations about, what would be part of the guide and whether or not, right, to include one text versus another text. And while we have also talked about this kind of potential canonization of this reformist mass incarceration text that circulates so much, like 13th and New Jim Crow. Our goal was not to create an alternative abolitionist canon and, this, must do reading list in order to, start organizing and working together. But we came together and we had discussions about, what could be useful in this collective process of study. And we wanted to bring in different types of texts, right? Not just chapters from books, but we're talking films, we're talking art, podcasts, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, I do think that what we selected were works that came from folks who have been, connected to movements, accountable to movements. And so I think that some of these discussions that we had, we were also learning from each other, about different ways in which, texts came together. And so this was also just part of, I think, our attempt to come up with a guide that would be useful, especially to people beyond the university classroom. So I'll just share those thoughts for now.
Thank you. I got Shayna. I think you want to contribute to this.
The only thing that I'll add, I think I just want to highlight something that Setsu said, which is that I think it can be easy to imagine, and this is something, Melissa, you said earlier, right? That you're reading that one sits down and reads to a finishing point, right? And I think that that there's some sort of absolute knowledge to have. And I think that one of the things that we focused on again and again was how to do two things. One was making sure that in the sort of debate among the texts that folks were referencing earlier, that the texts themselves get at the question, right? So that the guide itself is shaped around the questions, not because we think they're the best questions, the right questions, but because they're really the questions we're also grappling with, right? And these texts are, and I mean texts broadly, right, are ways of thinking through those things. I think the other piece that I wanted to highlight that Setsu mentioned, was about making it usable, right? So what does it mean to get? I know that I get a list at the beginning of the semester of like a whole set of books, and I'm like, and then someday when I have a vacation, I will read all of these books, and at that point I will be ready. And so one of the pieces we also really wanted to make possible was for someone to say, I'm looking for this thing, and here's a poem, right? Or here's a specific chapter out of this book. Maybe someday I can read the whole book, but right now. And so the other big piece of what took so long was that we annotated every piece of it, right? And so the goal was really to make it a useful tool. And in that sense, not perfect, right? So I think I want to invite people to download it and really, as everybody here has said, regardless of where you're situated. And I think there are actually some really amazing questions coming up in the chat and in the questions around this idea of doing teaching and learning stuff together, right? Of study, to use this thing, right? And to use it as an entry point, to be able to build on those pieces that are there. And it may be that you read a particular chapter, you discover a poet or an artist or a film, and it takes you down, another route that is not present in this particular list. But I think our hope is also to think about the ways in which those texts, right? Listening to Layli Long Soldier read a poem next to watching a film, next to reading from Racial Capitalism, begins to do that work that Priya was talking about, right? To build a framework, to build a way in, that it's not just about sort of access in the sense of what people feel that they would be able to absorb, but more in the sense of the radical capacity to make meaning in different ways, right? To discover ways of talking with people that maybe you didn't have before, or ways of thinking of things that perhaps were not open to you before. And I think for me, that's a huge part of why we kept, I think in every question, we made a point of trying to make sure that there are images or films or audio pieces or poems as a means to really be able to draw out the importance of all of those making practices, but all of those also as sites of knowledge production.
I'll just repeat how honored and humbled I am to be in community with these folks here. And I'm really proud to be facilitating this conversation. I'm also do my best to keep track of what y'all are popping off in the chat. It's great. I love it. I love reading chats during live conversations, and the Q&A is already starting to expand. So we're going to spend our last 20 minutes together trying to engage with as much of the Q&A as possible. My apologies in advance to the fact that we simply cannot adequately engage all of it. But like I said, we're going to do our best to try to compile your Q&A and include it for posterity as in some way with the recording that's going to go up. So thank you all. This is, again, I want to say this exemplifies the forms of collective study that I think we imagine and envision provoking with the resource guide. So that's what collective study looks like. It's messy, it's beautiful, it's joyful. It sometimes has conflict and debate in it, and that's how it should be. So y'all, I'm gonna move into the Q&A now, and I'm gonna start with Kim Jackson's question, which I think is great. I think it's a beautiful question. I think it really gets at some of the things that I know come up in the different collective settings that I've been involved with in the last going on 25 plus years, trying to do this kind of political educational, and imaginative work. So I'll read Kim's question out loud, and then I'll just open it up, and y'all just jump in. So Kim Jackson's question: thinking, studying, analyzing, reading, and imagining are not on their own praxis. Praxis requires an engagement with the day-to-day life in carceral society, focused on those most impacted by it, and analysis should come out of that. Can you speak to the complex relationship between folks with lived experience and teaching abolition and the movement for abolition? Many people with lived experience are not necessarily going to read texts, but they hold knowledge and should be foregrounded in the struggle as a praxis. So beautiful layered question, beautiful layered challenge, I think for all of us, not just the folks on this roundtable. Could we collectively think about Kim's question together for just a minute or two? Who wants to jump in? Seta, you unmuted, why don't you go?
I really want to say thank you for that excellent question, because as someone who has a day job in a kind of colonial institution like the university, whereby I see all around me a kind of two-dimensional level of what my students call, I guess, performative politics a lot of the time. I think that this kind of embodied struggle on the day-to-day and engagement and conflict with the carceral society is essentially what we need to be doing beyond what you said, studying or thinking or reading. And so I appreciate that, and especially your point about centering and working alongside of and in support of those who are most impacted by these interlocking systems of whether it's carceral violence, racialized gendered violence, institutional violence. So I think that what you are saying is a good challenge to a kind of traditional concept of study or reading or thinking. Thank you.
Folks, others, I know I got thoughts on this. Priya, go.
Okay, well, I mean, I was just going to jump in and say, yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. And I think particularly thinking about praxis as study plus action, right? That then sort of circles back into study, right? I guess I think that sort of cyclical, or it's not really cyclical because I think we're doing it at the same time, but learning shapes, right? Reading, all of that, right? Shapes how we act in the world, and how we act in the world might shape how we read too, right? That those things are interactive. Is a really important point to emphasize. And so for example, the point of teaching abolition isn't really just so that people study abolition, it is so that people do abolition. And I think that that's a really good thing to emphasize. I also, your question made me think about my classrooms and the way that I think, even in a traditional university classroom, many people in the classroom's lives are impacted. But I mean, I would say that everyone in the classroom's life is impacted by the PIC, but some people in the classroom's lives are impacted very closely by the PIC, and that having space to study those institutions can be a way that people sort of reformulate, rethink what those institutions have meant in their life and can be a way of developing a different political orientation to them. You know, and then I think also, right, like I currently work in a prison higher ed program. And so I really think that like there is a long history of study in prison, and that is, you know, that can't be, the importance of that can't be discounted, and the really profound effect that reading can have in terms of, you know, incarcerated people building community, kind of reimagining their circumstances, thinking about their own experiences differently, and also being able to share, right, politics that emerges from inside the prison of abolition. Like, I think all of those things are really important. And so I do think that, you know, study, right, can, I do think that like people impacted very directly by carceral systems, that study can be, right, like an important vehicle for politics that engages those communities.
Other folks, I was going to share something on this as well, but I'm going to bite my tongue until other folks get a chance on this question. Go ahead, Erica.
I mean, Priya and Setsu, super brilliant. So I wanted to underscore that it's always about engagement, right? Study and engagement and is practice. And I really also appreciate the question, but as somebody who has taught and learned in a whole range of contexts, I'm not sure that any one constituency has the monopoly on not wanting to engage with texts. So thinking like, I think that there's like the reason why I offered the example of us spending like, you know, a whole meeting on one sentence is sort of an openness to struggle. And I have appreciated, and this process has reminded me, working with these fabulous comrades has reminded me about the work of study and struggle, and working through hard ideas and hard concepts together. And I have, you know, somebody who works inside, you know, as somebody who works with systems impacted folks in the free world, and, you know, all different, I'm both, you know, inspired and engaged by people's willingness to want to do that work to struggle. And I'm also frustrated about how many conditions in our everyday lives, you know, make it very challenging for people to do that when you're trying to engage with childcare, when you're dealing with, you know, a pandemic and healthcare issues, when you're working, you know, your Dunkin' Donuts job and trying to Zoom in your class at the same time. So I just wanted to flag those kind of things, but really just loved what Setsu and Priya offered in response to that smart question.
And I'll just add a couple points to this before I move into our next question from the Q&A, which is, you know, one of the things that I quickly learned being in community and active collaboration with currently and formerly incarcerated people over a period of time is that what we name as experience and being incarcerated or system impacted is not a substitute for analysis, politics, and principle, right? And that's what I saw play out all the time with folks in those extended communities of people. So I think in addition, I'm just adding, in a sense, I'm not challenging what Kim is, what Kim was saying here. I'm adding to it. I'm saying that in addition to being in community and collaboration and praxis with people who are directly policed, incarcerated, criminalized in these asymmetrical ways, that there has to be a collective insistence on a kind of principled sharpness of analysis of commitment in a principle. Like, it always has to be guided by that. And that's kind of one of the points that we're trying to bring forward in the resource guide. We can't keep coming back to reformist bullshit. Right? It is literally killing people in these asymmetrical ways, right? It is actually a life and death problem, coming back to reformism all the time. So I just want to repeat and amplify that. Y'all, we're getting a lot of folks that are asking questions about what the deal is. What is our beef with New Jim Crow and 13? And I want to preface this by saying that I want to prop up the fact that the author of the New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, who I had the pleasure of sitting on a panel with shortly after her book first came out years and years ago. I don't want to freeze her in time. I don't want to just, you know, come after her book and think about, you know, how her stuff has not stayed the same over time. Her stuff has moved since the time of this book was published. So I want to honor that at the same time that I think that it is a collegial and comradely thing to do to debate and criticize each other's work. So I want to tie that point that folks are asking in the chat about what the issues are with 13th and New Jim Crow, with the question that Dave Mayer, I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, with the question that Dave Mayer raises, which is the following: is it important to define what abolition is not? As more folks join our movement spaces and study and struggle together, I'm thinking about how to avoid reformism. So to me, that ties directly into some of the critical analysis of Ava DuVernay's film documentary 13th and Michelle Alexander's book, New Jim Crow. So can y'all go in a little bit on that? And so we're not leaving folks hanging. Maybe somebody who didn't have a chance to respond to the last question in substance. I've already lost track of who did. So y'all just jump in, please.
I can start. I have a suspicion Melissa has things to say about this as well. But so this question about what abolition is not, I think we've been saying this, that one of the things that I think is important is to note that this is not about being dogmatic. It's not about creating lines that can't be crossed. I think it is about understanding or having a politics and an analysis around both the system of the prison industrial complex, right? So what it is intended to do, whether or not it is in fact reformable, so to speak. But also the idea of what struggle produces, right? Of what, I mean, sort of tied to the last question, where knowledge gets made that resists that violence, that becomes a way of being with one another in ways that do not reproduce those violences. And so in this sense, I think one of the ways those questions that shaped the guide came about was in the frustration of looking at what we're increasingly kind of taken in as these comprehensive critiques of what was wrong with prison, right? Or what is wrong with policing that do two things. One, deeply oversimplify the nature of that set of concerns. So if we're asking the question what abolition is not a politics of trying to make prisons better. It's not, in fact, presumes that the prison, that the borders, that surveillance, that policing are built to produce violence, and it can only ever produce violence. That there's not a way in which those spaces can be humane. There's not a way in which they can be helpful. Recognizing that people's lived relationships to them are incredibly complex. So I would argue that on the one hand, abolition is not ever an effort to make those spaces or systems better, right? Now we can have a whole long conversation about what it then means to deal with the actual conditions with which and in which people are living, right? So the actual impacts that this is something, I know a question, there's another question in here about doing abolitionist teaching inside, and I think it's something that I've heard Priya and Erica talk about before in that sense. But so I think that's one piece. And then the other piece, and this is not so much what abolition is not, but it's a piece that it sort of drove this project, and I mentioned this earlier, is that these texts quite literally write out organizing. They write out, in fact, the knowledge that that Kim's question pointed to, right? Like write out all of the ways in which people live either through organized struggle or day-to-day living outside these systems, in opposition to these systems, survive in spite of these systems, help each other navigate these systems. These are all forms of resistance to both the carceral state and the prison industrial complex. And these texts forego that story. So I think the other thing that abolition is an understanding of what we are making all the time, right? Both what we are imagining, but also what we are making. And to not center that in some way, right? To not deal with it in a comprehensive way, or not deal with it in a serious way, points us to so-called solutions that maintain the systems themselves. So I would argue that this is not saying what abolition is not, but because abolition is a praxis and a practice of building and making things with other people, to not talk about those practices while sort of talking about the violence of those systems undoes our ability, and back to where I started from when I was a wee tot in a room in rural New York with, Dylan and others talking, it undoes our ability to imagine, right? If the most we can ever imagine is to make a humane jail, right? Like they're trying to do where I live, then we don't have the capacity to imagine any of these other things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shana. I think Melissa, you wanted to jump in on this a little bit too. Is that right?
Sure. Where to begin? I'll just say a few things, because I'd love it if the historians among us sort of tackled some of the critiques about kind of the through line from slavery to mass incarceration, which is a big part. I'll start, I think, by saying a couple things about 13th, for example. So, because I think that film kind of exemplifies what I was talking about earlier in terms of the everything is everything politics, right? Wherein there's just sort of talking head after talking head, and everyone is sort of presented together as telling one big story. So you have Angela Davis, Brian Stevenson, Marie Gottschalk, Michelle Alexander, right? You just go through this whole gamut of people, and there's no sense of the debates between these activists and scholars, right? You get the sense that everyone sort of together has this one narrative, which just isn't true. All of the people featured, or many of the people featured in that film, in fact, have not just distinct, but contradictory analyses, that really emphasize different things and sort of see the problem differently. So I think it kind of flattens the very important nuances and disagreements that exist within the movement. The other thing is, or a big thing for me, and I found this particularly in my teaching with undergrads, is there's sort of a conspiratorial tone, right, in the way that racial disparity and racial impacts are discussed, right? So there's this sort of haunting idea that white people who harbor individually racist views are sort of deploying this system of mass incarceration to control Black people and other people of color in a way that I think really does not allow us to understand the sort of deeply systemic nature of racialized violence that shapes and undergirds the system, right? So if it's all about sort of the racial bias of whites who have these negative attitudes, then again, sort of as we've been saying, then that suggests that the solution to that then is to replace those people with other kinds of police officers and prison guards, or to train those people, or, right? It doesn't sort of get at the systemic nature. And I've found that even in, trying to teach Alexander's, I think it's chapter 5 on the color of justice, which actually does a good job of sort of showing how systemic racism is built into the system of courts and sentencing, but students somehow seem to come away with the takeaway just being about individual bias rather than racial structuring. Similarly, there's a huge focus on profits, but again, in this super simplistic way, right? Like that the only profit interest or money interest in the prison industrial complex is the people who literally have stocks in private prisons or who are supplying goods to prisons, as opposed to kind of a deeper analysis of how capitalism drives the reliance on imprisonment. We're almost out of time, so I won't go on and on, but also the near singular focus on Black men, right, at the expense of the many targets historically and contemporarily of the prison industrial complex, which again is not to say that a focus on Black men is not incredibly important, obviously, but if we think that that's the only target of the prison industrial complex, then we misunderstand what the system is and more broadly what it's designed to do.
Right on. I know we are approaching the end of time, so I did want to end with a kind of by grouping together some of the questions that I think will give our folks here and people watching this recording a point of departure. I'll also note that I think dozens and dozens of people who here have put their emails in the chat. That will be compiled. Y'all are going to be contacted. If you're watching this recording, please feel free to reach out. Reach me at dylanrodriguez73@gmail.com. I'm happy to try to build community that way as well with y'all. As far as the 13th, the film 13th and New Jim Crow go, I will just add to what my comrades here have said, that what both of those texts do is they induce what I would call a militant reformism, right? They rely on notions of disparity, as Melissa just said, of bias, of fixability, and they breed militancy around the idea of fixing a criminal justice carceral policing apparatus that can somehow be made to not be anti-Black and classist and colonial and patriarchal and misogynist and and heteronormative and transphobic and Islamophobic and all the rest of it. So that, for me, as somebody coming from a position of trying to think as and analyze as an abolitionist, that's one of the fundamental problems, is how a militant reformism ends up being the takeaway point that folks bring from these two texts, which I think is a deep problem. Let me close this out by asking us to think together about how we'd respond to a group of questions that were raised by Ash, Ormaza, Sujin Ko, Allison Carrington, and others that have to do with how to build solidarity, how to continue to teach this kind of work to young people, meaning elementary and middle school children, how folks can get involved in the growing and different communities of abolitionists. So it's a kind of an open invitation, I think, that we're being asked to accept to further cultivate people's involvement and interaction. So what would y'all say to the folks who are asking those kinds of questions to us, how to get further involved and so forth? And I'll say, we'll end with this, and that's with apologies to the people who have raised really important questions about about detention of undocumented people and migrants, about people who have brought up the ties between abolition and Islam. People have talked about abolition and disability justice and all kinds of other things in the Q&A. Again, we will list that when we post the video. My apologies that we just didn't have time to get to all these questions. It was not intentional at all. But yeah, let's close with this, and I'll ask folks to respond to that. Maybe two or three of us can respond to the kind of question and challenge from our participants on how they can get further involved. What would you tell them?
Sure, I'll go quick. I'm just super heartened by all the people circulating their email addresses in the chat with a willingness to form some sort of study into action group. I just want to say that across the globe, in synagogue basements and storefronts and community college classrooms, there are networks of people that are organized and pushing back on the failed promise of Title IX on campuses to produce safety and trying to build transformative responses to campus-based sexual violence. There are people building campaigns to say, no, we're not going to just give the police a 2% raise in this, we want to actually reduce and shrink and end our reliance on policing to demand safety. So I just want to encourage people that are newer to this conversation to do like a critical audit of your community. I love Dylan's frame of like having some attention feelers for, I can't believe I just put my hands on my head like that, but for militant reformism language, but just, get active, get involved, pay attention, think collectively. But I am energized in this moment by the mushrooming up of older and newer networks that are building transformative practices and responses and engagements. And I just want to encourage people wherever you are to do some work to try to study in relation to those formations and the histories of the space and places that you are and those formations, and also get active.
Right on. And get one other, but go, Shannon.
I was just going to add one quick thing, and I think this ties to what Erica said, which is I think it's more possible than you might think, especially if, well, whether you're new or not new, to find one thing to work on with other people, right? So it might be that Title IX piece at your school, if you're in a school. It might be as straightforward as having conversation. Well, it's not straightforward, right? But the work of having conversations with your neighbors about what's going to happen if you all hear a fight outside, right? Are you going to call the police? Are you going to build another way to check in with each other, right? It might be about seeking out one thing you want to learn as a skill, right? That you can then pass on to others. Whether that skill might be things like conflict transformation, or beginning to get interested or learning skills in mediation. It may also be thinking through any of the texts in our list or any other list, and beginning to think about, well, what's one thing that sounds familiar to us, a thing that we experience where we are, right? That we can begin to address. And I think it can feel overwhelming, right? I'm based here in New York City. We have a new cop mayor who wants to reopen, quote unquote, humane solitary confinement at Rikers. That feels like a lot to try to get into. But I can, meet up with other people in my neighborhood around the increased call for policing in my subway station and see if there's something we can do there, right? I can talk to my neighbors in my building. So I think it's often good just to, I know I'm with you, Edwin. I think it's often really important just to remember it's just little pieces of work, right? And those things allow us to keep building things together. So I just wanted to say that piece.
Appreciation, you all. We've gone a little bit over time. But Erica, you wanted to report out on the question. Yeah, our roundtable will stay after, if you all don't mind staying after. I will simply say, as a close to this conversation, or as a point of departure, as a jumping off point for this conversation for y'all that are here and that are watching this recording, identify your skill set. That's a really important lesson I've learned in the last period of time. Everybody who is watching this, who is here, who's listening to this, who's reading this, you have a skill set. Identify what your skill set is. Figure out how you can make a contribution to building community around a collective study of what an abolitionist practice would look like and be where you are, what it would feel like where you are. The convening is so important here. There's no magic formula. There's no single website to go to figure out how you're going to be in an abolitionist, community organization. To just reflect back what my friends and colleagues here and loved ones here have just said, it's already present. It's probably around you. It's just a matter of making a call out to folks the way that some of you have started already doing during this conversation. So with that, I want to express my appreciation to all of you all who have come through, and my virtual asynchronous appreciation to all y'all that are watching this recording. And with that, peace to everybody.